on my attention. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 10200, the Politics and Media podcast, where today we are going to be covering tech, which is political and has media coverage. So I think we're in the clear. I'm joined by a range of co-hosts. We've got a little panel this afternoon, this early evening. Joined by my co-host Ginny. How are you doing, Ginny?
Hi, I'm good. I had to look at AI today at work, which sucked, and I got really mad about that. So this has been timed really well because I can vent about it on the podcast. Thanks.
Fantastic. We've got Mandy Hank here. How are you doing, Mandy? How you going? Who are you now? In what capacity are you here?
That's a really good question. So, my friend Byron Clark and I run a community education org now called Dark Times Academy, and we work to pull together really interesting, really smart people into classes that can be delivered for other really interesting, really smart people. And we can do some both educating and organizing and socializing together.
Fantastic. So if you're really interesting and really smart, you're probably going to want to get on that just to prove that you are. And our final co-host today, Mark Rickaby. How you doing, Mark?
I'm really good. Thanks for asking.
And special guest, going to be here in New Zealand next week for a series of talks. Jathan Sadowski, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. Excited to talk to you all.
Yeah, really excited to have you and kind of step through some of the topics that you're planning to bring to our shores. Have a bit of a conversation about AI and how horrible it is, how fucking horrible it is, and the impacts on the rest of us that aren't electronic beings. Do you want to give the audience a little bit of a rundown of where you're from and what you do? What angle are you coming at this from?
Absolutely. So I'm here to sell you all some life-changing AI products, flog the benefits and promises of the coming utopia. No. Although I do work with a lot of people who do that because I'm a senior lecturer in Melbourne at Monash University in the Faculty of Information Technology. That's what I do for a day job. But what I do for fun and the things I'm interested in is I do a lot of work on the political economy of technology. So thinking about how technology is a product of social power and financial values and those kinds of relations. And to that point, you mentioned I'd be in New Zealand next week. So I'm going on a little 3-city speaking tour. I'll be in Wellington, Dunedin, and Auckland, giving a talk called A Ruthless Criticism of AI, because despite being an academic in an IT department, I have also written a book called The Mechanic and the Luddite. I'm a proud Luddite, and I see that as a necessary political position that everybody should take on technology. Luddism is not just a hatred of technology, but it's an understanding of it as inherently political. So I'm excited to come over to New Zealand from Melbourne, give a series of talks and promotion of my new book, and spread the message that AI is something that deserves to be ruthlessly criticized at all times.
And especially in the current climate where it feels as if there are dueling realities, right? With this lobbying framework, it's political or corporate, using the term AI to describe this absolute grab bag of technologies at this point. With, you joked about it as you started your intro, these really utopian promises about what it's going to deliver without at all talking about the downsides. Or no, that's not even a fair way to critique it, because the downsides are not even in the picture at all. It's often just outright dishonesty.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. Because AI is this thing that's extraordinarily ill-defined. I mean, it ranges the gambit from being an Excel spreadsheet with some marketing around it to being promises of a artificial machine that is on par or surpasses human levels of cognition, right? And AI encompasses anything in between those two poles, and it really is, I think, in a lot of ways, very cynically deployed to to market something, right? To say that some system has abilities that it's not proven to have, but you just need to believe it does. To say that you should buy this thing because it's going to make you more efficient or make some system more optimized or solve unsolvable problems if you just put enough faith into it. But I think that's really the utility that AI plays in society right now, is as this like the kind of question mark series or step, and when you define a problem, define the solution, you've got the question marks, and then at the end is we've done it.
Yeah, or dollar signs, right? It's the other common form of that meme. What's been really interesting is the shift away from the early hype as ChatGPT and other ubiquitous AI forms were coming into the public sphere, where this is groundbreaking. It's going to change the world. It's going to revolutionize the way that humans interact with technology, and it's going to move slowly through the corporate ladder to then do, as you say, that those arguments about efficiency and saving money, cutting jobs, into now like fear, like I really like, if you do not get on board with AI now, you will lose. Your business will go under. Your government will be behind other governments. It'll be a national security threat. And watching that run out at pace has really been quite something, as well as these different, I don't know if techniques is the right word, but we'll just use it. These different techniques have been used to try and keep people on board, to keep people buying in, and increasingly to provide government funding for really large, extensive physical structures, often in terms of things like data centers.
Yeah, I mean, it's really remarkable how quickly AI has become this not only like this universal solution, but this universal imperative, right? This idea that like you have to get on board. You maybe you don't know why you need to implement AI up and down your institution, but you just have this feeling that you have to, or somebody above you is telling you, you have to figure out how to do this. I see this in the places where I work, like in universities. This is happening across Australia. I know from talking to colleagues in New Zealand, it's happening across New Zealand universities. It's happening in Europe. It's happening in the US. It is this universal sense that suddenly we need what at my university is being called the PAIR system, or a programmatic assessment and AI review, which is systematically assessing every aspect of education in the university to ask the question, can we put AI into this unit, into this curriculum, into this course or program or whatever it might be. And the bias is towards adoption. You have to explain why AI is not appropriate to include in your unit, rather than the opposite, which should at the very least be the case, is you should be justifying why AI is beneficial for this, or why AI is good to include. But the bias is towards the opposite. Adopt, and if you don't want to adopt, then you have to justify why you're not getting on board with AI. And I see this happening across governments, across other financial institutions. Pretty much every corporate or governmental organization is getting on board with this. And I think it's a lot of people really buying into some remarkably successful sales pitches without a lot of empirical evidence that they actually provide any real social benefit.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something we've ever seen the management strata do before.
It's been framed as a technology shift, and I think a lot of normies have kind of bought into that because they think, oh, this is the next big thing. But I think there's from people who, say, like myself, have been working with AI for a long period of time, and before it was really kind of framed in that way, and I'm just kind of astonished, like, what is going on? This is not a meaningful thing. It's a marketing strategy, or it's sort of like a kind of sort of consent manufacturing strategy. And it doesn't make any sense because it's putting the traditional product development or strategy question back to front, and you see this even amongst the software and technology people. They are shoving it into products for no particular reason. So it's sort of like it's kind of fractal. It's happening at the strategic organizational level, and then it's happening at the low level of people just making really poor UI decisions about like shoving chat boxes and open text prompts into software like PDF readers that have nothing to do with open text prompts. And it doesn't really make any sense. And it's just all part of that kind of process of like people believing in this massive technological shift when it's not really a technological change at all. And certainly the way it's being delivered through these user interfaces that are just like search boxes or chat bots, which are very, very common and well understood. Like no thinking or exploration has gone into how do we actually make this technology work as a service. That whole step has just been skipped. And I think that's where it's really not about the technology. It's about power and about deployment of financial resources and capital to sort of acquire like computation, to sort of outsource computation. And that's the framing that I've been taking for a long time. I haven't really seen anything like this happen before after working in the technology industry for a long, long time. I still don't think I've seen something that's kind of beyond a fad, beyond a trend, just to that level of kind of connection to political economy. This is kind of a new thing.
So I've seen this before at a sort of smaller and more niche scale. I mean, my training and the vast majority of my career was as an academic librarian. And I came into the library world. I started working in a library as a student assistant in 1998, just when JSTOR and Science Direct were starting. And then I continued, my education into library school, and then my sort of early career years spanned that period when we were not only transitioning off of the catalog and off of the sort of printed card catalog, but onto this giant database, and not just many giant databases, but ultimately really one giant database where we were taking not only our metadata, but also articles and then eventually books, and really completely enclosing them into this technological system. And the kind of hype that you see now with the AI companies was very, very familiar to me as the kind of hype that I experienced as a new librarian and as a sort of up-and-coming librarian. And as a sort of up-and-coming librarian who had political training and had a heck of a lot of doubt about whether it was really a great idea to hand over, humanities scholarship over to companies who were then going to sell it back to us at eye-watering prices, the impact of that hype, and you see it now with the AI hype, is to completely marginalize anyone who advocates for limits, anyone who advocates for care in the adoption of these, at the time they were journal sort of systems and metadata systems, and now they're AI systems. But it's the exact same dynamics, just at a horrifically larger scale, right? It's hard for me to imagine. I mean, Jathan, you talked about Monash examining where AI could be inserted in throughout the learning process. I mean, you gotta, there is some cheek there. Can you imagine, Dark Times Academy getting Monash University to carefully examine every part of their educational system to see where we should be inserted in and given chunks of cash?
Everywhere.
Think of that.
But these kinds of systematic reviews and I think to synthesize the points that both Mark and Mandy have made as well is that I do agree the having this happen so swiftly and at such a large scale is really strange and meaningful, because ChatGPT was only released 2 years ago, November of 2022. Before that, the vast majority of people never even spoke the words AI in their normal life, right? It was not a consumer kind of facing product or this thing that should be seen as a universal solution. And so that's very quick that happens, and that happens on the wave of this massive torrent of money and the even larger speculation that there's more money to be extracted from somewhere. And I think to what the point you were making, Mandy, is right as well, is that these things don't come out of nowhere. They are always they are always existing. These dynamics, these kind of social relations, these technologies, they're always existing in different places, you know, with kind of beta testing or experimenting or pushing the boundaries to see what you can get. And it's usually in places where it's the easiest to do it. So somewhere like a library where it's fundamentally an information system, so it's easy to overlay a different information system on top of that, and on places where people have the least power to push back against it. Libraries, places that are systematically underfunded and under-resourced and don't really have the ability to say, we don't want to do that, right? And so that what we see now is the outcome of those kinds of experiments at small scale merging with, like, you know, this huge giant black hole of money that is pushing AI towards being this like systematic universal thing. And with that comes, you know, the reason why something like these systematic, you know, programmatic assessments for AI review, the reason why these things happen as well is because they're pushed by major corporations. So like Monash has a massive license with Microsoft, which has Copilot, which is an AI assistant that it has that's powered by GPT, the same underlying model of OpenAI's ChatGPT, and it's meant to be this like daily productivity AI assistant. And every student and staff member at Monash has free access to Microsoft Copilot, and we are encouraged to use it in our everyday work, right? And so why would Monash spend a huge amount of money on this license for every staff and student member if they weren't then going to also implement systems that try to force some kind of return on that investment, make people use the technology? And then with that comes the management consulting industry complex that's greasing the wheels of this. That's, you know, and now every organization, the reason why there's like this institutional convergence where universities, governments, corporations all look like financial institutions is because they're all following the same governance documents that McKinsey, Deloitte, Accenture, PwC are selling them, and just control, you know, doing a find and replace of, like, you know, from National Australia Bank to Monash to Department of Transportation, you know, it's all the same document. And it makes me think of this piece, this really great piece in the New Yorker that Ted Chiang, the science fiction author, wrote a few months ago, where he was relating AI as being like the new McKinsey. And by what he meant by that is that AI and McKinsey are both systems organized around optimizing the further concentration of wealth and power in an elite group by maximizing their ability to extract value and minimizing the rights of everybody else to resist that extraction. And Chiang noted, I think very rightfully, that AI, quote, sharpens the knife blade of capitalism. And I think that's it right there, is that it's not that AI is an outgrowth of capitalism. It absolutely is. But it's also this like avatar of capital as this kind of overarching, transcendent social force in our lives, the way that Marx talks about it. We can now point to it and say, like, that's what AI is trying to be.
Yeah, and purely as a concept as well, because as we've said, like AI in and of itself, it means so many different things depending on how it's being utilized and how it's being used as a justification for doing this stuff, right? It's how do you define it in that sense? Is it best to just look at it as a tool of capital extraction? Like we throw this word at it, like just a marketing ploy or a sales pitch? Because there's not really much that it does except for get into every system and then exist and require large amounts of money to be fed into it. And then also beyond that, begin to require large amounts of physical space and energy output at the same time, which is entirely seems like a a massive acceleration for extractive capital and for the capitalist system, but one that would probably ultimately end in much quicker collapse than we might have seen otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really key point here as well. Like, none of these technologies are immaterial or digital in the sense that they're like, exist somewhere else besides our material physical reality. And that's I am happy to see in even the like general analysis of AI that you might see in like a mainstream newspaper. There's at least like now recognition regularly that AI requires massive amounts of energy and resources and space in order to exist. And what finally got people to recognize that fact is that there's been like $1 trillion of both existing and planned capital expenditure around AI infrastructure. So that's building data centers, but that's also things like upgrading and expanding power grids, energy production, in order to meet this much greater demand that these data centers that are necessary to hold all the data, to run the GPUs, the processing units, the computational power required to train and operate these models, that this infrastructure is putting huge amounts of strain on energy grid systems that, at least I know in the US, energy usage has not really increased in any meaningful way for the last like 25 years, except for the last 2 years, when suddenly there was like very, very large percentage jumps of like energy usage and requirements in the US. And we're talking about an energy infrastructure that is already largely obsolete and straining against its ability to operate at like normal paces, right? And so like, that $1 trillion of capital expenditure also not only speaks directly to its immediate and very real impacts on, on humans, on society, on the ecology, when we start linking it up to things like climate change, right? Like, it's accelerating those processes. But in a really kind of ironic twist as well, it also helps explain why everything we've been talking about around AI being this like pervasive, insidious force that is trying to colonize and dominate every market or institution it can. Those same kind of like capital expenditure, the $1 trillion of capex, the cost of the infrastructure, the cost of the resources and energy, that also drives this real profit problem for AI. You need not just $1 trillion of revenue to make up that $1 trillion of capital expenditure. You need about $3 trillion of revenue, because you need to make up the capital expenditure. You then also need to pay the ongoing operation cost the OpEx of the system. And then you also need a hefty profit margin, because otherwise, why would any corporation or financial institution be interested in it, right? And so now these companies are on the search for $3 trillion of revenue with a technology that currently is bleeding, hemorrhaging money. So it's not making a little bit of money, it is hemorrhaging money. And so that leads to this like desperation that we see now around AI needs to be included into everything, whether you want it or not, because we, the corporations making it and the financiers underwriting it, need that to be the case.
Yeah, and it's one of these things as well, because they're so desperate, everything's being sold as AI. You've got a whole range of stuff that's being integrated that doesn't work. Like, a lot of it just breaks. It breaks entire systems when it's added in. A lot of it, like, we've talked about it on the podcast previously, and maybe our audience will be aware of it from other spaces as well, but like AI hallucinations, I talk about when you're trying to get information out of something like ChatGPT and it just makes up garbage and pretends that there are real books about the particular topic you're asking about. You've got this idea of like AI slop, where AI is generating creative, heavy air quotes, content, and it just looks absolutely absurd and like something not of this world a lot of the time, and sometimes just look like complete trash. No one really wants this in a lot of ways. It is how it feels. but people are told that they want it, and they definitely want the thing they're being promised. And it's just that doesn't exist.
I mean, I think that is like such a very interesting characteristic to all of this as well, is that nobody wants it. I agree. I think nobody really wants it. This is something unique that I've never really seen before with any of these like technology bubbles or hype trains, is that in the past, Silicon Valley has been really, really good at selling that vision, not just to people that manage procurement budgets, but just like everyday consumers, right? Selling this vision that actually something like Uber is really good for you. Something like DoorDash is really having servants on call is really great, and it's going to make your life so much better. You know, it's not the gig economy; it's the sharing economy, right? These kinds of things. Even stuff around like Web3, we talk like NFTs or crypto or blockchain. A lot of, that was starting to push the limits of credulity for a lot of people, where they're like, but for a lot of people, they were like, this is just silly. This is, if they weren't on board with it, they were like, this is just stupid. It's silly. It's a distraction, and a welcome distraction from the COVID pandemic, which is when a lot of that really popped off. But I think the AI bubble that we're in right now is really unique, where I see so many people, like not just people like me who are like professional critical scholars of this technology, and so we don't like any of it because that's my like immediate bias is convince me why it's good. But like everyday people, like friends, family members, people I talk to who are not in this space, who don't think about these things, people I see on Twitter, on social media, like there's this universal sense of like this largely sucks. Like, why would anybody want this slop? Why would anybody want something like ChatGPT beyond it being like a novelty, when it is like so clearly, after you play with it for a little while, like its usefulness really pushes its limits pretty fast, right? You have to be a real true believer. And so that adds this other element of like strangeness around the political economy of technology. Is they're really having to push uphill and in this real top-down way, because they don't really have any grassroots support for the technology. All the support is largely like astroturfed, or it's largely involuntary. Someone above you is saying you have no choice but to use this or get used to it.
That's one question I guess I've had for a little bit is how was that particular, and maybe no one can answer this, but how was that particular marketing concept, how was it actually successful given the absurd failure of a range of things like this that came before it? Like you mentioned NFTs, right? Immediately, no one knew what they were actually trying to do. It was hard to explain to people what the usefulness of them were. Then a whole bunch of people were making apes, and everyone was like, this is garbage. Whereas with AI, they've very successfully been able to link themselves to, I guess, parasitically, this science fiction idea, right? Like where everyone is like, oh, we know what AI is. That's, human consciousness, but like roboticized. And in all the sci-fi I've ever seen, like it changes the world, like can do so many cool things, and without any proof at all that what's being sold is able to do these things. They've been able to hijack that kind of conceptual framework about what AI is. Any thoughts on why it worked this time, or why they were able to do it to this level of success, at least with this particular strata of decision makers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is really at its base like a difference between the imaginaries of the technology, or rather like the stories we can tell about the technology and the things we can envision the technology doing. And so with like Web3, we're talking crypto, NFTs, these kinds of things. The underlying technology there is the blockchain, right? And the blockchain as a technology when there was a lot of money being funneled into Web3, there were a lot of places and institutions and people talking about like, we're going to put we're going to put government on the blockchain, or we're going to put, money on the blockchain, which is what like crypto is supposed to be, right? Like we're going to put things on the blockchain. But like, one, people could not really understand the underlying technology of blockchain. It's like so esoteric. It's complex in a way where it's not complex because it's technical. It's complex because it's convoluted. You have to do a lot of explanation, but also just a lot of taking on faith that the technology works in the way people claim it does. But it also meant that it had really limited like use cases in people's imaginations. What does it mean to put like insurance on the blockchain, right? Like I don't know what that actually means. And talking to people who work in these industries where, they're hiring people specifically for, or reshifting people into positions specifically around like lead blockchain visioneer, right? Where it's like, figure out how we can put our industry on the blockchain, because there's like billions and billions and billions of dollars of investment, and even more than that of potential value to be gained in this. So we have to figure out how. And talking to people whose job that is, they're like, I don't know, like I can only do so many PowerPoints that like, that gesture wildly at like what blockchain is going to do for our institution. So there's a real failure of imagination there, which I think led to this like failure for liftoff in a meaningful way for blockchain. That's something that AI does not have a problem with. It becomes a lot easier to imagine how AI could do stuff in everywhere that a person does it, because AI is sold as a like person but better technology. Anything that you can do, I can do better, is the kind of underlying slogan of AI. And so if you can imagine a person doing something, you can very easily imagine an AI doing it, and doing it faster, instantaneously, more accurately, in ways that surpass your wildest imagination, but you can still imagine and form what that might look like. And so then it becomes extraordinarily easy to like tell stories about it, right? And that's ultimately what technology is built on, is it's built on the stories that we can tell about what it might do, because those stories are a necessary stopgap until something material can actually happen. Because the whole political economy of technology is ultimately a speculative one. It's built on fictitious capital, promising things in the future and cashing checks on those promises in the present, right? And so you need people to believe in those stories. I call this like something like the Tinkerbell effect for technology, where like Tinkerbell requires you to clap loudly and believe hard. If you don't clap loud enough and believe hard enough in Tinkerbell, then she starts fading away. And so the Silicon Valley needs you to clap hard, clap loud and believe hard in a technology, because if you stop doing that, then it starts fading away. And that's exactly what happened with most Web3 things, right? But AI has been so much more successful at telling those stories, getting us to believe hard in it, clap loud for it, because it has our imagination on its side. We can understand it positively or negatively, but we can still kind of have this grasp of what it is and what it might do, whether that's good or bad.
I think as well, there's an effect of these kind of spectacular stunts. So, like, there's a long backstory to the development of AI, and there have been attempts before. There was a strange little phenomenon around 2014, I think, if I remember right, where all of a sudden the tech press was filled with stories about robots and the robot revolution. And there was a sort of strange little influx of, and I think that I'm not sure on the detail of that. I just remember kind of observing about it and writing about it at the time. But that seems to line up with the self-driving cars and kind of computer vision thing. And that's also where Hinton and those big developments in neural net architecture first took place. So there was like a bit of a prehistory to that. But again, that didn't really take off in that same way. But I think maybe cumulatively over time, people's resistance has just been kind of bulldozed over because this has been out there in the culture for so long. I think also when ChatGPT emerged, it wasn't really framed as anything with a particular purpose. And there was a lot of discussion amongst tech experts and design people around how risky that was because it was far too soon to be releasing something publicly. In fact, OpenAI actually did a bit of a stunt with their press releases around that, kind of saying, oh, we're not going to release our new model because it's too risky, and look at us being ethical and stuff. And that, in hindsight, that all looks part of the same sort of marketing project. But to actually have this technology in the hands of people, being able to bash on your keyboard and then see this ridiculous response, people hadn't really, for most people who hadn't been messing around with AI or doing things with technology to that extent, this did seem like a new technological development. And I think like ChatGPT is actually fairly useless unless you sort of look at that kind of McKinsey type consulting thing of just like pumping out emails, and you just have fake emails replying to fake emails like turtles all the way down type stuff. But it's a showcase of like, hey, this can generate believable human language, and that makes people kind of perceive things to be in a certain level, and maybe kind of creates a bit of a connection between that sort of imaginary of the technology and the actual kind of experience of it. Whereas the real thing that's happening is sort of AI as a decision technology, and to outsource the sort of human decisions and social processes, and which is the real intrinsic kind of purpose of it. And it's not really conveyed in that user experience of ChatGPT that this fundamentally is about making decisions or sort of outsourcing decisions.
Yeah, I was going to say on one of those notes, Mark, there are uses for stuff like ChatGPT that is kind of evil. So one of them is making a whole bunch of bots and flooding social media and creating discourse and narrative in that way, right? Creating a whole bunch of slop and just throwing it out into the system. It is a use that is being used for.
Yeah, I feel like, students who have an essay due tomorrow at 8 a.m. are being really overlooked in this conversation, which, gets you back to sort of the questionable uses.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, we see all kinds of other really damaging uses of ChatGPT or other products that are built on the underlying GPT-4 model that OpenAI has, which, there's like now this whole booming industry around what's called like GPT wrappers. So it's just industries that don't actually have a technology themselves, but are instead building an interface that is powered by an API access to GPT-4. And, OpenAI has a number of these products as well. Like I think about one called Whisper, which is a transcription tool. And people might have seen the reporting that came out from the Associated Press a few weeks ago talking about how researchers have found that this transcription tool is being widely used in hospital settings to transcribe interactions between doctors and patients. And the idea is that it's sold as a way to lessen the administrative burden of doctors, so you can spend more time doing what matters, which is interfacing directly with patients in a really human way. And that's great. That's a good use value for some technology. But it just happens that these hospitals were sold that Whisper, OpenAI's product, or a competitor, Nabla, which is also built on the GPT-4 model. It's just a wrapper for OpenAI's model. They've been sold that this is the way to do this. But as researchers have found, and as was reported in the AP, unsurprisingly, the transcriptions from these large language models are full of hallucinations, right? They're full of not just poor transcriptions that you might see from like a voice to text algorithm that it maybe isn't, quite accurate, or there's some background noise or something, but fully just hallucinating, inserting things into the text that were not there, even if the audio is like pristine quality in terms of no background noise, high quality audio. And it's because you're using a large language model which is a probabilistic machine. It's just trying to predict the next token or the next word in a sequence. And you're using that as a tool to try to do transcription rather than using a built for purpose voice to text algorithm, something that's a little less, high tech, but far more effective. And this problem was, is wide was why it was not as if this problem was caught in the beta testing. This problem was only caught after academic researchers got access to a large corpus of these transcriptions, was able to go through them and compare them to the original audio, with Whisper, and finding out that that the vast majority of these transcripts had at least one hallucination in them, which could very, dramatically change what a conversation between a doctor and a patient, right? And then those transcriptions become data sources to train like diagnostic machine learning models. The problem cascades from there, because anything that a model creates that might be data could at some point be used as data to train some other model later down the line, right? And so you just get these compounding consequences that largely come from using a tool that is not built for that purpose or not fit for that purpose. Not just the tool like, oh, Whisper is just bad, you should use that. It's like, no, the underlying technology, a probabilistic large language model, is not good for doing accurate transcription, but institutions have been sold, this is the way that you should do it. And those kinds of like actively harmful uses and misuses of a technology are so widespread now, because everybody's always trying to find ways to integrate not just AI, but a specific form of AI, large language models, machine learning models like these, into every process.
When it's something like that, which is so actively and individually harmful, like potentially fatal, right? Like I think we need to be really clear about the way that this spins up
And
once we're getting into.
There's at least one lawsuit right now against character AI involving a boy who committed suicide, and his family believe that character AI and his interactions with that product bear some responsibility for that death.
When do we start saying that the people selling this, it's like there's intent here? They know what they're selling. It's going to be something which is going to harm people, and they're doing it anyway. How do you draw that line, and how do you get people to understand that, I guess?
I mean, I think the problem here always comes down to like the real difficulty of doing things like, how do you draw these kinds of cases? How do you resist or go on the offense against these technologies? And while like something like product liability, so some form of like tort lawsuit, right, where you're trying to say OpenAI is the party that caused this harm, and so we want to have we want to sue OpenAI on a tort violation, or using precedents for product liability. Like that becomes really hard in large part because there's like so much precedence of companies watering down those forms of attack, right? It's like saying, it's the classic, like, can you sue a gun maker for deaths caused by the guns that they produce? And the answer is no, you can't. Like, can you sue Coca-Cola for giving you diabetes? You can't, right? Like, you can't do that because there's so few like legal routes that you can go towards actually holding a corporation accountable for their actions. It largely comes down to these kind of like regulatory moves of some kind of oversight or active regulation, some form of accountability. But we know that those systems have also largely been hollowed out or just captured by the industries that they're meant to regulate. We also know that like a lot of these industry specific regulators depend very heavily on consumer complaints to catalyze some form of regulatory action. And so then it becomes a chicken and an egg, right? Where it's like, well, you need, to reach a threshold of consumer complaints in order to catalyze some kind of like regulatory action. But if there's no avenue for meaningful consumer complaints, then you can never reach that threshold that catalyzes regulatory action. And so then you're just spinning your wheels while the companies are operating business as usual.
Yeah, I think, Jenny, this is something that you wanted to get into because, obviously on some level, corporates are failing us, regulatory groups are failing us, government decision makers are failing us on a lot of counts regarding this. And there have been I guess technology attempts to try and start. I don't know if you call it fighting back or at least like slowing down some of the incidents of AI in technology and creative spaces. Jenny, you were saying at the beginning of this, you had to look at AI all day. What did you want to kind of draw in here?
Well, I mean, just for some really brief context, I am an advertising management consultant. So like before, just wanted to get that like elephant in the room like out of the way first. Wanted to say I'm completely on the side of the humans. So like Jathan, like I am on your side. Please don't come for me. Don't put me up against the wall when the revolution happens. I have never supported AI and I don't want to. But just in terms of my work, just generally, like obviously, as you have just mentioned, a lot of this stuff is dictated top down. Like the partners at the firm are not the people who are like, yes, I need to integrate AI into everything. It's sort of like emblematic of the wider economic environment where the clients are asking for firms to have opinions on AI. Like as you mentioned, people like NAB and BNZ and ASB, they have this notion that AI is the inevitable future, and any sort of advice taken from anyone has to include an AI component, which then in sort of a really sick and twisted loop influences then more ideas and more interaction with AI in the wider business, despite, I guess, everyone else's objections. But I wanted to talk mainly today, or ask you mainly today actually, about things like Glaze and Nightshade. So I work with a bunch of designers who are obviously really pissed off about the whole AI thing. And we obviously, from a commercial perspective, clients, even though they want to make use of AI machine learning, don't want to have, I guess, their ads being used in that way, right? To train other people's competitor ads, for example. And so there is a real, I guess, like a twofold thing to this is clients talk more and more. And obviously, as someone who hates AI, I think more and more about things like tools like Glaze and Nightshade that are meant to protect artists' work from AI. But I've heard that they're not as effective as they could be or should be, or that we're at a point whereby, I guess, how in my layman's eyes or knowledge, how Nightshade and Glaze work is they add these like permutations to existing data to essentially make sure that whatever AI learns from an image is fucked up. Pardon my French. So like if you give it like if you go, here's my photo of a dog, I'm gonna slap Nightshade and Glaze on it. If an AI picks it up, will go, oh, that's a cow, that's a cloud. Like it'll just like learn the wrong information from it, essentially. But I just don't know how effective that is now, if that still works, because I kind of feel like it seems like you're getting into a game then of tricking, I guess, an AI learning model, right? And I feel like with enough passes at the back and forth, the AI learning model will learn that it's been tricked somehow and learn how to work with poisoned images. So after that long spiel, my overarching concern or topic today, I suppose, that I was curious about asking you about is, are there any real meaningful ways that we as people can use tools to fight back against AI? And do these tools have to be in some form, I guess, like using the bones and skeleton of AI? Like, are we using a model to fight another model? Or can we do something entirely novel and different that prevents it from being influenced in the future?
Yeah, no, I think this is really a great topic and great line of thinking here as well. Like I remember when I read about Nightshade, I found it to be very cool and very interesting, right? But and this idea that you can poison the training data of a model so that it does end up creating these really degraded outputs that disconnected from, like you said, you ask it to create a dog, and it gives you like the most grotesque Cronenberg cow you've ever seen before, because it's been trained through poison data that that's what a dog looks like.
Tell me more about this grotesque Cronenberg cow.
But I think it's a very cool way to like it's a very cool tool. But I do worry that like it's a losing battle to fight to try to do the like you fight fire with fire, fight AI with AI in this way, because I mean we also see how like that lends itself to, the companies selling the problem are also willing to sell the cure, right? Because like OpenAI has released a ChatGPT detection tool, right? That you can then be like, well, if you're worried about students writing their essays using ChatGPT, then run it through our tool and it will be able to tell, was this written by ChatGPT, right? And so you create the disease and then you solve the cure. It's
Has anyone coined LLMLM yet?
Well, I mean, there you go. Exactly. I think that is the first time I've heard that amazingly. So I think you need to copyright that one and run with it. But but ultimately, I think for me, it's not as if I think these things are useless. I think that they are one of many things in our collective arsenal that we can use. By all means, I think like poison the training data of these models. I mean, I think the companies are kind of doing that themselves anyways, because I mentioned things like using the products of AI transcriptions in medical settings as a way to potentially, I haven't heard of a company doing this, but that's just because one hasn't been started up yet, using that as training data to create like a medical diagnostics machine learning model. I mean, that's, those models already exist, but they're using like electronic health records to try to do this instead of like transcriptions. But there's also this problem. I've coined this term of Habsburg AI, which is where you get these inbred models that AI trained on the outputs of AI, and there is a lot of technical and empirical data showing. I coined this conceptually, saying this could potentially be the case where you end up with then models that are like have these like grotesque exaggerated features because they are inbred, right? Their DNA is breaking down in that sense. But there has been research by a number of computer science teams across the world showing that there is this form of model collapse that happens. The more that an AI is trained on the outputs of other AI, the more quickly the model degrades into nonsense. And this is a huge problem for these companies because you can't Google image something now without being given a ton of DALL-E responses for it, right? Like the internet is already poisoned by so much AI generated content, both images, videos, text. And this is a huge problem for companies that are trying to use new forms of data to create new forms of models. You can't scrape the internet anymore because you just don't know the quality. I mean, they were never concerned with the quality of the data anyways, but now they have to be concerned with not only it being low quality data, but being poisonous data, right? You get what another group of researchers that I've talked with at Rice University call model autophagia disorder, or MAD AI, and like mad cow. And so they're already effectively nightshading themselves by poisoning the well of the internet. So, but I think to me, tools like Nightshade are more like interesting thought experiments. They're like forms of like culture jamming, right? Where it's like we were never going to topple capitalism by doing like 90s forms of like adbuster culture jamming, but we were able to at least like start a bunch of conversations that then led to stuff like the battle in Seattle, right? The kind of like mass movements against the WTO in Seattle in the 90s, like these kinds of like real collective movements of people standing up together to resist some form of institutional or technological or political economic force that seems to be unresistible. It seems to be too large to handle, too big to resist. But that it makes it a collective problem rather than an individual problem. Culture jamming, nightshade, individual refusal, these are all necessary tools in our arsenal, but they're not the solution to the problem. I think that they have to be things that lead to and help spur and coordinate larger collective movements. That's the only way that we can actually resist these technologies, resist these institutions or these financial imperatives, I think, is through collective movements. It's things like labor movements taking and unions taking this on as a union issue, right? Like we saw with the Screen Actors Guild and Writers Guild of America with their strikes. I know people working with Teamster unions in the U.S. I'm friends with people at the United Workers Union in Australia that covers a large number of industries, including warehouse and logistics sectors, that they are taking the imposition of these technologies as a union problem. It's a big reason why I'm coming out to give my speaking tour in New Zealand next year, is because in addition to Mandy's Dark Times Academia, the New Zealand Tertiary Education Union is sponsoring my speaking tour, because the union, I think rightfully so, is seeing the use of AI and the imposition of AI in university settings as a union issue, because it is. It's a labor issue, it's a political issue. And these are the only ways I think that we can actually effectively resist and challenge and ultimately transform these things, is by doing so collectively, understanding them as political problems that require political solutions, and targeting their foundations, not just being content with some tweaking around the edges of the model. Rather than this KPI, could we make it a slightly more humane that KPI? But instead saying this technology, in the way it's been financed, designed, developed, and deployed, is fundamentally anti-social or anti-human or anti-labor or whatever, anti-environmental, whatever it is that we want, whatever values we want to safeguard, posing those arguments that the technology is incompatible with those values in the way that it exists, and then going from there as our starting ground for fighting back against them.
I think there's another side of resistance too that it's important not to overlook, in part because I think it involves some inter-community organizing, and that's looking at the data centers themselves and helping to build resistance movements as they try and scale up and build more and more of these data centers. There are some very natural and reasonable alliances that can be built between, for example, folks who care a lot about climate, folks who care a lot about whatever that environment where the data center is being built. And I think that if the sort of tech crit community and communities interested in environmental justice were to work more closely together and sort of start building those alliances and building plans defeating data centers, it's a very local problem, so you're going to end up with some interesting coalitions, but I think you could do it in a really effective way. And I think that if you sort of look at things, don't try and focus on like the scale of it, but instead focus on lots of different avenues of resistance, lots of different people working together with different techniques, different strategies, different approaches, but towards that one overall goal, so that, the culture jammers aren't going to do it by themselves, but they very much help make the idea possible. And they do a lot of that imaginary work that maybe the folks in climate who would never think to oppose a data center will then sort of be connected to, so that you can open up new pathways of resistance through building those new coalitions in service of this larger goal.
I 100% agree. And I think that's a really important point there, Mandy, that like building this diversity of tactics, thinking about how and how each thing can link up together and not only build weird coalitions, but like counterintuitive ones too around like why would actors in Hollywood care about indigenous groups in New Zealand, protesting against the opening of a new data center. Well, it's because like this value chain is a global value chain, and all of those things are linked together, right? That like Google has just recently announced a $200 million data center that they're going to be building in Fiji, and so it's like, well, that's a really weird move. Why would they be doing that? But also, why should I care about that, right? And it's like, well, because that's a way that Google and through them, the U.S. and Australia is trying to create these kind of like techno-imperialist footholds against China in the Pacific Islands, while also further casting the kind of umbrella of power that they have, that Google has over what AI and these technological infrastructures mean in places not just Fiji, but in New Zealand and Australia, right? Where and so I agree. I think it's about understanding that these industries understand what they do as a part of these global supply chains and value chains that are intimately linked together. And so it really is in some ways the like act local, think global. If we talk about the Battle of Seattle and the kind of 90s, it's all coming back again. Everything old is cool again. But I think these kind of creating these interesting coalitions of local movements, of kind of cross-cultural, cross-continent networks. Like I think that is what's necessary to really effectively reshift this conversation and the technology development at a really material level.
Is there anything that you can really use as a wedge there, though? I'm just thinking about the pace at which this is moving, right? And the way that all our decision makers have kind of just been gobbled up. And they all believe that AI is the future. We had, was it called GPT?
GPT.
Like
GPT,
being
yeah.
pitched in New Zealand, and maybe it's going and maybe it's not. I don't know.
Yeah, it's going. It's just not working very well because no
Yeah.
one's using
Not
it.
working very
But
well.
how do you get those people to flip, right? Like because so much in the last couple of years, as we've had a couple of what you call like moral inflection points around stuff like Gaza, has shown that we are in an age where it doesn't matter what the public thinks. Like it doesn't matter like how you're organizing a lot of the time, because they're not interacting with the reality that we are at this point. Our decision makers do not have the same KPIs as we do. They do not have the same outcomes in mind. You're mentioning the use of data centers across the Pacific as a bulwark against China. Like we could all really hate that, but with Five Eyes through the Commonwealth countries, that is not going to be a significant reason for our political decision makers to change tact on this, right? So where is that link in terms of creating communities of change regarding this? How do we flip those people at the like sharp end of it that are directing the money, are directing the capital expenditure, more or less without any input from their electorates or their audiences?
No, I think this is a very important point as well, because you're right. Like the reason why we are talking about this now and the reason why we're having to think about it all the time is because there are other people who are not us that have different interests and different values who are saying, well, AI is going to advance those interests and those values. And so if you're the elite in the corporate world or in the government world, you fundamentally have like values and interests that are disconnected than like the vast majority of other people. And so you do things that you think will advanced those interests and those values, regardless of the protesting from the hoi polloi who do not understand why this is actually really good for everybody, or rather, it's really good for us, and it doesn't matter if it's good for you. But so I think the way that, I mean, of course, the long march through the institutions requires like changing what those governing interests and values are, at a base level. But in the meantime, we kind of have to. I think you're right that like to get change at that level of like government policy does require in some ways like convincing them on their own grounds that it's also not in their interest to build these systems or to contract and procure these technologies. And I think it really is about showing what is the case and what we know is the case, which is that these technologies are ineffective. They don't work, and they don't even achieve the values of these elite policymakers, let alone like the values of the population as a whole, or some idea of socially beneficial technology. They don't even achieve their own values that they're trying to advance. And I think we have to show that to them through by in some ways by talking their own language, right? By I think through research, through submissions to the regular kind of inquiries around these things or the interest around them. Like, I think that there is this level. It goes to what Mandy's saying as well around the kind of diversity of tactics and strange coalitions that are necessary. Is like you do also have to speak the language of the university administrators or the government policymakers and show them that this system is actually not doing what you even want it to do. It's not achieving the goals that you have. It's a huge waste of money. It's making everybody's life worse. And why are you even doing it? Now, I was talking to a friend of mine who is a data scientist who has a data science consultancy, a software engineering and data science consultancy. And he's against a lot of this as well, but he talks a lot to people who are in like the C-suite of corporations and organizations, CTOs, CFOs, CIOs, people who might be procuring business from a data science and software engineering consultancy. And we were talking about it just recently, and he was telling me that he hears from a lot of these C-suite people that they don't even know why they're doing this, in the sense of like why they're procuring and using the AI. They just feel like they have to, right? And so even the people at the top of an organization feel like they are also but pawns to AI and capital, right? To these transcendent forces that orchestrate people's behavior, that they also don't have a choice in the matter. And so I think there's a lot more people who are a lot more willing to listen to the argument that this stuff is ineffective and it's bad and it's ultimately counterproductive to whatever goals that they have. But they also need arguments and reasons to resist the thing that counteract the arguments and reason, the very strong arguments and reasons that are told to them as to why they need to do the thing, right? Because I think a lot of people at these levels also just feel like they are being buffeted by outside forces and imperatives and interests that are telling them you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. And you need the kind of counterforce there, not only telling them don't do this, but showing them why it will not achieve anything that they think that it will.
I think too, to go back to something that Mark said before, our language can fail us here sometimes, because I think that like the generative AI stuff is slop, right? I think that it is very, very easy to make arguments to ineffectiveness and to, this is not going to achieve the outcome that you think it's going to achieve. That's a really easy argument that will over time be proven extremely true. Where I think things get trickier is what Mark raised with the predictive AI. It's not so much a question of whether or not predictive AI works to do what it is claimed it does, but it definitely serves the interests of people in power in many cases, particularly if you accept the idea that predictive AI is largely about shifting accountability and hiding who is responsible for decisions that are made. So I think that like we have an easier road to go down with the LLM stuff because of what obvious utter nonsense these things are, and because of the fact that a lot of what they do is stuff genuinely people don't want a machine to do, right? It's like the machine that fucks your wife. We don't want a machine that talks to, our children when they're sad. That's supposed to be a core part of being human. That's what we do. But deciding who gets a job, deciding who gets what social welfare benefit, making child welfare decisions, making a range of policing decisions, all of these things are being used by systems that are also called AI, and that have much better serve the interests of power. And that's where I think the real battle is still going to have to be fought. And that's where like techniques that build power is like that's all I got. We build power, we take it over, we get rid of those people, and we put people who suck less in.
I think that's that makes a lot of sense. I think that was exactly the point I was trying to get at. That or at least my concern, my worry, I don't know if this is 100% accurate, is that the parlor tricks and stunts of the generative AI is creating like a permission structure for these decision processes that are actually aimed at a more of a bureaucratic kind of standpoint, where you can swap a human process with this kind of computer says yes or no, where that human process has a sort of logical decision outcome. Perhaps the line gets blurred when we're talking about generating text and where the text fits into these sort of decision documents. But I'm thinking more like the algorithms in, say, the court system, which we know there've been some that ProPublica investigation from 2015 or 2016 was really pivotal in kind of in raising my awareness of what was already happening. And we've seen a lot of terrible stuff in Australia, obviously, with the very low-tech algorithms that were used that created a whole range of problems leading up into deaths with the benefit payments. And I'm not going to kind of relitigate all that story, but it seems to me like a lot of these things were already well underway. And that transition from human bureaucracy to sort of automated, sort of or augmented bureaucracy. And that was my kind of concern, was like the chat GPT sort of, or the video and image generation is just providing a bit of a way to sort of bring the public along while these other sort of structural kind of decade-long changes are taking place. So but I don't know. That's sort of a bit of speculation.
No, I think that's right though. I mean, you gotta be a critical accountant in the C-suites and a revolutionary in the sheets, or in the streets rather. But I think you have to speak both. You have to be able to do both, right? To be able to speak that language of here's why, like, at the level of like financial accounting and bureaucratic effectiveness, these kinds of systems are going to not advance your interests. And so you should abandon the sunk costs that you've already got in them. If we look at our 5-year projections of how much it's going to cost to license and operate these models, how much revenue would you need in return to make that return on investment make sense? Now, is there any way that you could possibly imagine that you're going to get, say, $500 million of return on investment over 5? Like those kinds of arguments really matter to people who are making those kinds of decisions based on ledgers and things like that. But I 100% agree that that's only one form of AI, quote unquote, and it goes to something that Kyle was saying at the top of the show around like, how do we even define these technologies? How do we nail them down? Because they are really they do contain multitudes. And I think it's those kinds of like predictive systems that have long been in effect, long been being used, forms of predictive policing, things like Robodebt in Australia, right? Which was essentially just a really crude automated system. There was nothing AI about it. But those are also the things that they exist not to be effective, but they exist to justify the exercise of power in the way that it's already going to be exercised. And so then that becomes a case where that's no longer a question of like financial and organizational effectiveness. That's a case of social and political analysis of power and that and the kind of the inherent politics of these technologies and raising that awareness that you were talking about, Mark, like that, yeah, that ProPublica piece that I think drew that to a lot of people's attention who had no idea these kinds of systems existed. I think the more reporting on the more forms of these systems that exist and have proven to have very detrimental effects on individuals and communities, the more that puts in people's minds, oh, none of this technology is objective. None of it is outside of people. None of it exists outside of these like existing relations of power and finance. That they are all just products of that. And I think if there's anything that I've really seen more and more since this boom of AI, we talked about how people are resisting it because people are like, I don't want this. It sucks. It's bullshit. Who would want this? Along with that, I think comes a lot more people who are like, not just recognizing but embracing the fact that like, oh, and all of this is being made to like not further my interest but actually to like actively harm my interest because it's just power by other means. And so the more that we can be able to pose multiple forms of arguments against multiple forms of technology, the more we can actually affect change. It makes it a really complicated and hard thing to do because the industries have designed it to be a very complicated and hard thing to understand or resist in any way. But that doesn't make it any less important. If anything, it makes it more important for us to be able to do that.
Do you think there's going to be another winter, or that there's going to be a kind of a bust after the boom?
There's going to be a Butler in Jihad, I think.
Yeah,
I
or
mean,
has it just gone?
inshallah.
Has it just escaped all the rationality and connection to the sort of market? I don't know.
I think a lot of people in the industry at top levels are extremely worried that a winter is just on the horizon, that they have become very fat on a lot of cheap and abundant data, a lot of cheap and abundant computing power, a lot of cheap and abundant venture capital. But there are limits to that. And I think a lot of people, and they are very quickly reaching those limits at technical levels. We see the limits of things like scaling laws, where it's like, oh, actually this like logarithmic increase of effectiveness of a model for input of data is reaching limits where it's just plateauing. That we are seeing those technical limits, and we're also seeing the social limits of people are fed up with it. The financiers are not seeing the returns that they want. I mean, just a few months ago, Goldman Sachs had a big report that a lot of people were talking about that was calling into question exactly this around like, where is the value of Gen AI? And it was an extremely critical report put out by Goldman Sachs with a very long interview with Darren Acemoglu, who's an economist who just won a Nobel Prize, and he's a very critical economist around AI as essentially having no value proposition. And so I think that there's a lot of writing on the wall that winter is coming, and there's a lot of and there's a huge wall of cash that's trying to keep that winter from coming. And so, well, I think I think it's more of a question of what the bust looks like rather than like if it's going to happen. It's more how will it happen and what will the fallout of it be.
I think that's a good place to wrap it up because we have run over time. We'll do a quick round the room just with plugs and final words. Ginny, where can people find you?
You can find me. I'm Eggs for Dogs on all social media. I also wanted to say one last thing in terms of deterring corporations and companies. As like I said, an evil management consultant, one thing I can confirm that stops people from using AI as a product is just being embarrassed. and being told that their product and brand will be shit if they use it. This has worked for me in a pitch 5 out of 5 times to local companies. So just putting out there, if you're at my tier of professional and you are working with companies that want to use AI, can guarantee you the fastest way to get them to say no to AI is go, we've surveyed X amount of people, and they said that if they saw an AI ad that your brand made, they wouldn't buy your product. Like that has 100% hit rate for me. So
That's
go off and
praxis,
try
Ginny.
that.
That's praxis.
Fantastic. Mandy, where can people find you or what you do?
Yes, excellent. So you can find Dark Times Academy at darktimesacademy.co.nz or darktimesacademy.bluesky.social. You can find me on Blue Sky. I'm Sally Mander at Narwhal Librarian.
Fantastic. Mark, round to you.
You can find me at Metal, Maetl, on most social platforms, and my website, maetl.net.
And Jathan, thank you so much for joining us. Really glad to have you here. A little longer conversation than I expected us to have, but there's so much to get into, and you had so much energy kind of bring that conversation to us. Where can people find you in real life in New Zealand?
Yes, that's right. No, this was a ton of fun. Great conversation. Very happy to be here. So yes, I will on December 2nd be in Wellington, December 4th be in Dunedin, and December 6th be in Auckland, where I'll be giving public talks at each of those 3 places. Registration is free. I'm sure you can throw a link to the registration in the episode description. So yeah, please come. I'm giving a talk in support of my new book, The Mechanic and the Luddite, A Ruthless Criticism of Technology and Capitalism, which comes out in January. And so find me there. And if you love podcasts, I also host a podcast. And podcast listeners are voracious. I know this as an avid podcast listener. You can't get enough of them. And so I co-host a podcast called This Machine Kills, which is on the political economy of technology. So find that wherever you got this podcast. I'm sure it's on the same platform. And you can also find me on X, the Everything app, or Blue Sky, just at my name, at Jathan Sadowski.
We actually mail out episodes. We're not on any platform.
Well, I need to get on your distribution list then. I'll send some VCRs or 8-tracks of TMK.
Perfect. Thank you so much again for joining us. Thank you to our audience for listening. Share, like, subscribe. Just get the word out. I'll put the free registration link into the summary. Sign up, come along to a talk. It's really fun. We love to see people in person. And just hear those conversations in real time, because I think they often bring a sense of community and some kind of emotional resonance to some of these issues that just listening to us all talk online doesn't always do. We'll be back on the weekend with current events. We'll catch you then.
If artificers are then I'm living a pointless life, but I'm learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now. It's paved with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking race.